Throughout time, several people have gone missing as if they simply vanished into thin air. Even more puzzling is when neither the missing person nor their remains are ever seen again. However, there are cases when people who vanish reappear, sometimes decades later, in the most bizarre way. In today's episode, we will look into 3 stories of such cases. These people disappeared under mysterious circumstances, only to reappear in an equally, if not more baffling way. For 23 years, Richard Hoagland's wife and kids had no idea what happened to him after he disappeared on February 10, 1993. After an earlier divorce, Richard had found love again with Linda. The couple married and had 2 sons, Matthew and Doug. Their life seemed perfect. Richard had become very successful. He owned an insurance company, a 5-bedroom house in Indianapolis, and was able to afford to take his family on luxurious vacations. But their picture-perfect relationship came to an end one day in 1993, after 11 years of marriage. Robert called Linda at work and explained to her that he was ill and needed to go to the emergency room. Worried about her husband, Linda offered to leave work and take him to the hospital, but Richard declined as he felt he was too sick to wait for her and insisted on going alone. Because Linda had not heard back from her husband, she started calling the hospitals in the area to try to figure out which one Richard had decided to go to, but there was no record of him ever being admitted anywhere. Over the next few days, and without a word from Richard, his family and investigators couldn't understand what happened to him. It's like Richard had simply vanished. All of his personal belongings were still in the home they shared. He left everything from his clothes to his passport. Because of this sudden and mysterious disappearance, Linda was considered a potential suspect. Police were not sure if she did something to harm Richard or if she was working with him. They alluded heavily to the possibility that he was involved in some form of drug trafficking, but after no proof backing these suspicions, Linda was never charged, and eventually the case grew cold. Strangely enough, later that summer, 2 birthday cards were mailed to her sons, each containing $50. The cards read, "Maybe sometime soon we will get to see each other. I bet I won't even know you. It has been so long. Mind your mother. Bye, Dad." With no real proof these were actually sent from Richard, this was just another piece of the bizarre disappearance of Richard Hoagland. Over time, Richard's disappearance had not only devastated their family emotionally, but also financially. Linda was not able to sustain the lifestyle she and her husband had built together. She lost the house and all the cars, and eventually, her parents would have to step in to help. 10 years later, in 2003, Richard was legally declared dead. His 4 children, the 2 from his first marriage and the 2 he had with Linda, and his wife, who eventually remarried, had come to terms that Richard was gone, and they would never know what actually happened to him. Well, that is, they wouldn't know what happened until 23 years later. In 2016, Linda received a voicemail from Detective Anthony Cardillo of the Pasco County Sheriff's Department in Florida. He asked her if she knew who Richard Hoagland was, and she responded yes, he is her deceased ex-husband. What Linda would find out next was almost unbelievable. Apparently, back in 1991, a fisherman named Terry Szymanski was tragically killed in a boating accident. So when one of his nephews was working on a family project and found his uncle on Ancestry.com along with his marriage license, which was issued in 1995, he was horrified. Terry, who was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, had relocated to Florida and became a commercial fisherman. He was 33 years old at the time of his death and had never married nor fathered any children. It would ultimately take the Szymanski family 3 years to come forward and contact authorities. Once they did in 2016, an investigation was launched immediately to uncover who filed for this marriage license. Their search brought them to Zephyr Hills, Florida, where they found Terry Jude Szymanski, his wife Mary Szymanski, and their teenage son, settled in East Pasco County where they had been for the past 2 decades. Terry, previously known as Richard, had done quite well for himself over the last 23 years. He started yet another family, owned multiple rental properties with his wife, and even owned a plane that he frequently flew, as he was also a licensed pilot. Richard was arrested on charges of fraudulent use of identification, and after hours of interrogation and an extensive search into records of the new Terry Szymanski, aka Richard Hoagland, here is the story of how police believe Richard successfully came to spend more than 2 decades living in Florida as Terry Szymanski. In 1993, Richard was feeling overwhelmed by the demanding insurance company he owned and the everyday pressures of being a husband and father. He decided he needed a way out. So, after deliberate planning, he finally put his plan into action on February 10, 1993. After making the phone call to his then-wife Linda regarding his so-called illness, Richard drove to the Indianapolis airport, parked his car, and fled the city. Richard eventually made it down to Florida, where he rented an apartment in Palm Beach from an older man named Edward Szymanski. Szymanski was grieving. Just 2 years earlier, in 1991, his son Terry had been killed in an accident. Szymanski's new tenant would often stay up listening to the heartsick father talk about his son. While living with Edward, Richard eventually found and stole Terry's death certificate. The document would prove to be his master key to building a new life. He used the death certificate to obtain a birth certificate from Ohio. With the birth certificate in hand, he then applied by mail for an Alabama driver's license and used that to obtain a Florida driver's license. Now, as Terry Szymanski, he married Mary Hostler Hickman in 1995, and just as he had done twice before, started a family with his new wife. In February 2017, Richard Hoagland pleaded guilty to a charge of aggravated identity theft. He served nearly 2 years in federal prison before returning to Indiana, where a judge in Hamilton County ordered Richard to pay Linda and their sons $1.86 million in back child support. In February 2002, 43-year-old Brenda Heist was in the midst of a divorce from her husband, Lee Heist. Brenda was working as a bookkeeper for a car dealership in Lititz, Pennsylvania, and was concerned that once her divorce was finalized, she wouldn't be able to support her 2 children, 12-year-old son Lee and 8-year-old daughter Morgan, solely on her salary. As an attempt to prepare for the unknown future ahead, she applied for housing assistance in hopes of getting an apartment. However, her request was denied. The following morning, Brenda was reported to be very distraught as she dropped her children off at school. Later that afternoon, when the children were not picked up, Lee, Brenda's husband, was notified of her absence. Unfortunately, investigators had no leads. It was as if she vanished into thin air. There were no reported sightings of her, no remains were ever found, and there were never any known attempts of her contacting her family. Lee Heist even became a suspect in Brenda's case, though he was eventually cleared. The mysterious missing persons case eventually involved dozens of detectives, and although the trail had grown cold, the case had never been forgotten, with Heist's picture tacked to a wall at police headquarters. In 2010, Lee Heist, who was now remarried, filed a petition with the county court to have Brenda declared legally deceased as a measure he claimed necessary for closure for his 2 children. At this point, all of Brenda's personal belongings had been given to her mother, and her life insurance policy paid out to the designated beneficiaries. But the case would take an interesting turn 11 years later in 2013. Kelsey Smith had been living with a secret that she needed to get off her chest and decided that today would be the day she finally went and talked to police. Kelsey, who was recently released from a jail where she had been serving a sentence for a parole violation, sat down in front of an officer at Monroe County Sheriff's Department in Key Largo, Florida. She was very emotional. She was crying as she hung her head in shame. She knew what she did was completely wrong. Eventually, Kelsey composed herself, took a deep breath, and said, "I'll start from the beginning." Back in 2002, Kelsey had finally made it to Florida after hitchhiking along Interstate 95 for an entire month. The first 2 years after her arrival was rough. She was homeless, living under bridges, eating food thrown out by restaurants after they closed. She then met a man that she ultimately became romantically involved with. For the next 7 years, she and the man lived in a camper. They made money as day laborers, cleaning boats and doing other odd jobs for which they didn't have to show ID and were paid in cash. At one point, Kelsey began working as a housekeeper and was caught stealing a client's driver's license, the crime that initially landed her in jail. After her release and her relationship soured, she ended up living on the streets again for another 2 years. After serving time again in jail for a parole violation, Kelsey decided that she had enough and was tired of running. Kelsey went on to describe to police a time in her life back in February of 2002 when she felt extremely overwhelmed and one day just snapped. She had an overwhelming feeling that her family would be better off without her, and so, when approached by 2 men and a woman who invited her to hitchhike with them down to Florida on a whim, she decided at that very moment she would go along with them. Kelsey, previously known as Brenda Heist, explained to police she realized that she made a dreadful mistake and wanted to attempt to re-establish contact with her family. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned for Brenda. Brenda was ordered to finish out a jail sentence in Florida before being permitted to leave the state. Shortly after her release, she moved to Texas with her mother, Jean, who was understandably happy to have her daughter home. However, all attempts on her part were rebuffed, with her 2 children, now young adults, refusing to allow her back into their lives. As more of the story making up the past 11 years of Brenda's life was revealed, it seemed as if she had been enjoying herself while living the Florida beach bum lifestyle, selfishly free of all her responsibilities back in Pennsylvania. Her children expressed feelings of anger and abandonment and felt the decision their mother made 11 years prior was unforgivable. In 2010, Ron Saunders finally felt that his life was heading in a positive direction. The Australian man had been somewhat of a drifter for the past 20 years or so. Never recalling having a sense of stability, he had always worked various jobs on farms in exchange for a place to live, odd jobs on fishing boats and building sites, and at one point even found himself living on the streets, homeless, forced to camp on the beach. He had also developed a substance abuse problem, which he described he began to numb the pain of his dull and dissatisfying life. Subsequently, Ron moved again and found a new place to live called Saunders Beach. Since he had no true recollection of who he was or where he was from, he decided to become Ron Saunders. It was when Ron eventually met Pastor Barry Hayhoe, a truck driver turned churchman, that his life would change for the better. Hayhoe immediately realized Ron's good nature, so offered him a room at the River Life Church and a job as a caretaker. This was the first time that Ron felt his life had purpose. During his stay at the River Life Church, it was brought to Pastor Hayhoe's attention that Ron was having issues with his vision due to his cataracts, which is a condition affecting the eyes that causes clouding of the lens, impacting a person's vision. Because Ron was obviously too poor to afford any sort of medical treatment, Pastor Hayhoe helped Ron apply for Medicaid, a government-funded health insurance plan for low-income and disabled citizens. He was ultimately approved and issued a Medicaid card that he used to cover his eye procedure. Sometime after Ron's surgery, he received a telephone call from police officer Georgia Robinson explaining that she needed to come up to the River Life Church to speak with him as soon as possible. When she arrived, she sat down with Ron and could sense his nervousness. She immediately reassured him that he was not wanted by the police for any crimes, but was in fact a missing person. He was not Ron Saunders. He was Gabriel Nagy and had been missing for 23 years. Ron was stunned. As Officer Robinson continued to interview Ron and show him various photographs, he began to have a few flashbacks of his life as Gabriel. Things were coming back to him bit by bit. Apparently, back on January 21, 1987, in Sydney, Australia, Gabriel Nagy, a father of 2 children, Jennifer 9 and Stephen 11, had called his wife Pamela to say that he would be coming home from work that day on his lunch break. Following this call, Pamela prepared sandwiches, excited to see her husband. But Gabriel never arrived, and as the hours passed, Pamela began to worry. Very quickly, as night fell, she realized that something was terribly wrong. She knew that it wasn't at all like him to not call if something had come up. She followed her instincts and called the police, who started a search immediately. Pamela expressed to police that Gabriel had never been away from home without telling anyone, and it was soon that the local community started searching for the missing father. They feared for his life, imagining him alone in the wild Australian countryside. The next day, his burnt-out car was found on the side of the road, abandoned. More days passed, and still no sign of Gabriel, and at that point, His disappearance then became a full-fledged missing person investigation. Strangely, 2 weeks later, the police discovered that Gabriel's bank card had been used at a bank in Newcastle, 100 miles north of Sydney, to withdraw money. After tracking down the flow of money, the police finally found that it had been spent on camping equipment. That would be the only credible lead for almost 20 years, and unfortunately, the police's last clue to his mysterious disappearance. Over the next 2 decades, Pamela always hoped that her husband would reappear. She wouldn't believe that Gabriel had abandoned them without ever looking back, so she always made sure that their contact information was in the phone book in case her husband ever found his way back home. But after years passed, Gabriel's family had become convinced that he was dead, and they eventually relocated to the Sunshine Coast, about 600 miles from Sydney. Fast forward to 2010, 23 years after the disappearance, authorities were preparing for an inquest hearing being held in 2 weeks to officially name Gabriel Nagy as deceased. However, the legal process demanded that officers make one last attempt to find Gabriel. Officer Robinson did a final record sweep and shockingly found a Medicaid policy in Gabriel Nagy's name. After digging into the medical records from a recent surgery billed to the insurance policy, the police commissioner discovered that the man lived in Mackay, a town in northeastern Australia located about 1,000 miles from the last place Gabriel was seen. Investigators were immediately intrigued by the inconsistencies in the records. The patient would at times be listed as Gabriel Nagy, and at others, Ron Saunders. This is when Robinson made her way to the River Life Church to investigate further. Though he would admit that the last 20 years or so had been a blur, Gabriel always attributed this to his past drug addictions. Gabriel would eventually report that he remembered bleeding profusely from a head wound, and scarring on the back of his head was confirmation of the injury he believes caused his amnesia. Doctors speculate Gabriel may have fallen into a dissociative psychological state, also known as dissociation, sometime after this injury. A dissociative state is a traumatic neurological condition that causes a person to forget their identity. This condition can cause individuals to wander and, incidentally, abandon their lives. Psychologists describe this phenomenon as a puzzled stroll. It seems that this description fits perfectly with the state Gabriel found himself in over the years. As far as Gabriel's family, Robinson explained that it was ultimately Gabriel's choice to contact them, as by that point they had been notified that he had been found and was alive and well. That afternoon, Gabriel wrote a 7.5-page letter that he mailed to his wife and daughter, and 3 days later, received a text message from his daughter, Jennifer. 10 minutes later, the phone rang, and it was his wife, Pamela, and they talked until his phone battery died. Though it was never reported that Gabriel moved back home with his family, he did state that they picked up where they left off and are working on rebuilding their relationship. He expressed that although this experience has indeed left a deep scar on his life, he is choosing to only focus on the positive. And while he has managed to control many of his addictions, he still sometimes struggles with his mental health, but is grateful to now have his family watching over him. I'd like to take a second to thank you for tuning into Horrific Nightmares. If you would like to support this channel, you can leave a comment below and hit the like button. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with anyone you know who may enjoy it as well. And if you already aren't, I hope you would consider subscribing to the channel so that you won't miss any of my upcoming episodes. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.